On this week's Carrier App, we speak with Michael Thelander from Signals Research Group to get an update from the latest 3GPP meetings looking at 5G standards, which included a standoff between Verizon and AT&T over the timing on the release of standards. Well, thanks for joining us today. My name is Dan Meyer. I'm editor-in-chief at RCR Wireless News. And today we're joined by Michael Thelander, who's the president and founder of Signals Research Group, talking a bit about what's happening in the 5G standards process. So, hey, Mike, thanks for joining us again. We appreciate it.
Sure, no problem.
Great. Well, obviously, you guys are part of the 3GPP. I think a recent member, I think you've noted. So there's been a lot going on in terms of the standards body and the standards process for 5G. And I know you just got back recently from another event looking at that. So I'm hoping to get a little update from you on kind of what's progressing there in terms of this move towards 5G. I think everybody's talking about what's happening maybe as soon as next year in terms of trials, but obviously behind the scenes there's some other things happening out there. So maybe start off with that from you, maybe a little overview of kind of what you saw at the recent event there, and kind of what maybe top topics that kind of came out that you think are the most interesting in terms of this ongoing work towards standards.
Sure. So I've been attending the 3GPP meetings as a member really since the whole 5G standardization process started, and that was back last September. There was a workshop held in Phoenix, Arizona, and it really gave a chance for all of the operators and vendors to kind of, and some of the various vertical markets like the auto industry, to stand up and talk about kind of what their vision is for 5G or new radio, if you will. And I think by and large, everybody's vision is the same. I don't think it's like anybody has any conflicting views. Really what it comes down to is prioritization, and especially that's happening now. We'll kind of jump ahead a little bit. Everybody kind of knows what they want. The question becomes, when do they want it?
Yeah.
There's so many things that 5G can do. If you go back and you look at, UMTS, 3G, it was really, let's have, faster speeds.
Yep.
And better and higher voice capacity. And that was it. You come to LTE and it was faster data speeds, lower latency, and they were also concerned about, licensing of intellectual property.
Yeah.
Now you get to 5G, and there's 74 use cases that 5G is supposed to support, and they really fall into three categories. There's enhanced mobile broadband, massive machine-type communications, and then ultra-reliable, low-latency communications. Those are the kind of the three big buckets, and everything falls into that. So now, fast forward again. So I was at the most recent standardization meeting, and this was in New Orleans, and this was the RAN plenary. And I kind of look at the RAN plenary. So this is the radio access network, and this is kind of, I would consider the plenary as kind of like the management board that oversees all of the underlying working groups that develop the radio access side of things. So the protocols, the network architecture, the testing of devices, defining requirements, et cetera. And so the RAN plenary really says, okay, here's the guidance we're going to give to the underlying working groups for the things they should be working on, prioritization, et cetera. And if they don't prioritize it, then the lower level working groups basically can't do it, or they have to focus on other things. So at the most recent meeting, there were a couple things that really drove most of the conversation when it came to 5G. And I should note, at these meetings, maybe half the time is spent talking about 5G. The other half is talking about LTE, even to some extent UMTS and 2G. So really? It's not, 3GPP is not just spending their time defining 5G NR. They're spending a lot of time still looking at the evolution of LTE. So anyway, at the last meeting, probably most of the contention was a proposal from AT&T. And AT&T wanted to accelerate certain aspects of Release 15. Now, Release 15, if you look at 5G, 5G is really two phases. It's Release 15 and Release 16. At the culmination of that, they will take their proposal, which includes 5G as well as LTE, submit that to ITU as 3GPP's vision of what 5G should be. Anything before that, you could argue is really not 5G. It's on the path, if you will, to 5G. But until you get to release 16 and everything that it's supposed to offer, you really don't have what 3GPP will be submitting to the ITU.
Okay.
So anyway, backing up again, AT&T wanted to accelerate certain aspects of Release 15. Release 15 is supposed to be completed in June of 2018.
Yep.
And that schedule hasn't changed. AT&T wasn't suggesting that you change it. What they wanted to do is to accelerate certain aspects. So for example, when you look at the 5G network, kind of the first vision is that when 5G gets deployed, it will be deployed alongside LTE.
Mm-hmm.
And that's called the non-standalone option.
Mm-hmm.
And it's simpler to do because you're leveraging LTE for certain aspects, control channel information. The more important thing is you can also tie back into the core network,
Mm-hmm.
existing EPC network, or maybe an evolution of that. And that's far simpler than deploying 5G on its own with a brand new core network.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all of that has to be done by June 2018, but AT&T was saying, look, we need to plan for our capital. We got to figure out if we're going to be deploying 5G in 2017, 2018, whatever, we need to kind of have infrastructure built, need to know what it's going to cost, put things in place. Let's accelerate certain aspects of it. In particular, let's accelerate the ability to deploy 5G and have it tie back into our existing LTE network, both on the radio access side and the core side. And let's make that December 2017.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's a pretty practical reason that they have, the fact that they do want to kind of plan ahead,
Right.
which makes sense, but there's nothing sort of like evil behind the scene kind of thing. They just want to kind of plan stuff going forward.
Right, and then on top of that, it's easier to do. So if you have to have everything done by June 2018, it stands to reason that certain things need to be done sooner. They're easier to do. If everything doesn't get done until June 2018, that's you're going to miss the deadline.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was their view. Okay, so there was also then, and then they had support coming on board from some of the vendors. Vodafone was another operator that supported it. But right after that, there was a counter submission from Verizon Wireless, Samsung, and ZTE, to name a few. And they were basically saying, let's keep things as is. You know, and that's interesting because Verizon is the one that's saying 3GPP is going too slow.
Yeah.
And they're trying to be very aggressive in deploying, you know, their so-called 5G solution in 2017.
Yeah.
So their argument, and it has validity, they're saying that, look, to have something done by December 2017, that suggests that the physical layer stuff, so certain parts of that need to be done even sooner, i.e. September 2017. That really only gives the standards body 6 months to complete it.
Yeah.
And you know, starting in March is when kind of the work item starts for release 15. So that only gives us 6 months to get this part done, and that's just way too aggressive. The counter coming back from the other side is, well, they can kind of work in parallel. You know, doing it in 9 months is definitely reasonable. And if it's not, we're not going to get the whole thing done by June 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And so two things. So ultimately, nobody could agree. Things are pretty much left unchanged for now. You know, the schedule is June 2018 for everything. There's still kind of this gentleman's agreement. It's kind of wishy-washy that says, well, we kind of recognize that certain things could get done sooner. What those things are and what the deadline is still kind of TBD. Could be December, could be March, you know, who knows. So the interesting thing there is setting aside Verizon's argument and Samsung and ZTE, why are they suggesting that, especially Verizon, given that by all accounts they want to accelerate the standardization process?
Yeah.
You know, in fact, I just heard them very recently saying 3GPP is going too slow. Yep. Here's the opportunity to accelerate things, and they're not. And so kind of my view, and I've heard this from other people involved in the standardization process, Verizon is obviously being very aggressive in defining kind of their own they call it their own test specification for 5G, so they can do fixed wireless next year. So they want to kind of present themselves, again, this is my view, as kind of a leader in 5G.
Mm-hmm.
So to have an early leadership, you kind of want to delay everybody else. And so that, and you could argue AT&T on the counter side, AT&T is trying to kind of bring in Verizon, and kind of make them, I won't say look bad, but, kind of make them look better by actually following the real specification that's defined in 3GPP.
Yeah.
So I think that is definitely part of that. Samsung and ZTE, they don't have the leadership in LTE from a market share position as, the Ericssons of the world. And so it's not in their interest necessarily to define a 5G standard that ties back into an LTE core network, because they don't have as much leadership on that side of things. They'd rather kind of delay things, allows them to catch up. Again, Verizon Wireless, they want to show early leadership.
Mm-hmm.
They can't accelerate their deployments any faster.
Yeah.
What you can do is essentially delay or prolong the ability of others to deploy something. And I think that's, although Verizon's public statement of why they want to not accelerate things is somewhat valid, I think the real reason is different.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's almost very similar to what happened with LTE initially in this country, because Verizon was very aggressive on the LTE front. They were one of the first carriers in the world to launch LTE, and even their service here domestically came out, I think, almost pre-real LTE standards were solidified. And so I think some of their early equipment even had to you had to go back and update it to make them standards compatible. So it seems like, again, they're kind of almost following that same kind of getting out the early sort of path from a, competitive point of view, whatever it's going to be. But
yeah, I'm not so sure that I've never heard any suggestion that it wasn't necessarily, standards compliant. I know TeliaSonera launched even sooner, but that's a nice segue. So if you look at the Verizon specification, they define that even before 3GPP has actually completed the study item for 5G. So they're way ahead of the game. I'm not sure what Verizon has said publicly, but there's been kind of this view that, the initial network deployed by Verizon is going to kind of roll or evolve into kind of the 3GPP specification. Mm-hmm. The problem is the way the RAN 1 working group has defined the lower layer or the physical layer of 5G. It's not compatible with Verizon's solution. More importantly, from talking to various vendors, it's also not a software upgrade. So what that means is what Verizon is deploying is basically not only quasi-proprietary to them, it's also something that there'll be a very difficult evolutionary path to get them onto the real 3GPP specification. So you're talking basically a hardware swap out to get there. So I think it's great that Verizon and other operators are going out there and testing and trialing millimeter wave solutions. They can provide feedback to the standards body. In the case of Verizon, that's a much better solution than deploying, fiber to the home. So there's an economic argument there. But if they do massive deployments of a technology that is, although they've defined the specification, it's really their specification. You could argue that's proprietary. You've got market fragmentation now. It just kind of bothers me in a way that, A, you call it 5G, and then B, that you create this market fragmentation even before 3GPP has even started on the work item for 5G.
It's interesting. I guess, was there much coming out of maybe the international operators? You mentioned Vodafone obviously was kind of aligned a bit with AT&T, but are the other operators, do they view Verizon's move as counterproductive to what's going on, or what's kind of the view from outside of maybe the domestic market of what Verizon?
There was interesting. There was at the previous meeting, there was again some commentary about operators doing things early, and it's funny. Everybody has to be so politically correct that nobody would mention any of the names talking about it. But to your point, Well, there were other operators that took Verizon's view that we need to kind of keep things where they're at and not accelerate things. That's like a Deutsche Telekom, a Telecom Italia, a France Telecom. And I think in that case, they're not necessarily leaders when it comes to even LTE. And they don't necessarily have the financial capital in some cases to deploy 5G. So anything they can do to kind of delay, they have no interest in accelerating things.
Yep.
So not to say they're trying to delay things, but they'd rather take their time because they're not ready for it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of fall into that camp. So I haven't heard, no operator has spoken out publicly and said this is wrong from that. But there's definitely, strong views about having market fragmentation. Just nobody's pointing fingers at anybody saying that this is an operator that's causing it.
Interesting. And I guess I guess the whole timing aspect of this, again, it does seem like it's becoming almost like an arms race. Really, people are trying to get the stuff out so quickly. Is that causing? It sounds like maybe it is causing some consternation with the people who are actually, kind of tasked with not just the standards, but just kind of working towards what those standards are going to be. I mean, it seems like those guys are being pressured. Like you said, I mean, if we move up to a December 2017 timeframe, that compresses that time to work on it to 6 months, which just seems like, I mean, it could possibly be done, but I'm sure it's going to be troubling for those who actually need to do that work.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of effort taken now to make sure that whatever is being defined, in the area interface is kind of forward compatible and very flexible.
Yeah.
So they have what's called a flexible area interface, so it's basically forward compatible. You can do things, not only enhance mobile broadband, you can do things with very low latency, things that are highly reliable, to kind of guarantee that, the heart rate monitor, whatever it is, those transmissions go through. So I think there's a lot of forethought there. But you're right that, you don't know what you don't know, and I was talking to somebody at the last meeting, some of the lower level working groups, to some extent, they're being driven by, some of the leaders on those working groups are operators or vendors that want to really accelerate things, and so they're kind of rushing things. Good or bad, I guess we'll see, but we have to live with this technology, for another decade and a half. So it'd be nice if we get it right. But there is the other thing is, in fact, the last report we did, so 5G, this last standard meeting was in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And so the title of the report was Release 15, 5G Lite or Katrina 2.0. And I think the reality is it's probably more 5G Lite than it is Katrina 2.0. But the other lengthy discussion that was held regarding 5G at the last meeting was the prioritization of the various capabilities that the initial 5G technology would have. So again, as I said, there were 74 use cases, anything from robotics to drones to communications with airplanes, all those types of things that are things that 5G needs to support. Will 5G in release 15 support all of them? And the answer is clearly no. So then the question becomes, how do we prioritize and what things must 5G do? And I know initially, especially coming out of the European operators, they really didn't care about enhanced mobile broadband, mm-hmm. Because it just wasn't of interest to them. For them, it was things, kind of the evolution of narrowband IoT with massive machine type communications. That for them was really important in terms of driving the economy and creating lots of new vertical markets, et cetera. That's changed a lot. I would say right now, release 15, the whole, I wouldn't say the entire focus, but 80% of the focus is on enhanced mobile broadband. Mm-hmm. To give you an example, narrowband or massive machine type communications, as of now, that is not part of release 15 for 5G. Mm-hmm. That's been pushed back. And the view there is that, we've got narrowband IoT, on the LTE evolutionary path. There's a lot we can do there. The view is that, that's going to meet the use cases by and large.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's a testament to, I guess, the capabilities of LTE.
Yeah.
Is we can take narrowband IoT, we can evolve it, and they continue to do that in release 14, and now it's coming up with release 15 very soon.
Mm-hmm.
So there'll be a lot of new features and capabilities that don't exist today in the release 13 specification, and those new enhancements and features will suffice in the near term.
Mm-hmm.
But there's other things, I think, with release 15 and narrowband or the new radio 5G that could be more important, but they are being delayed into release 16. So I think it's important to note that again, release 16, the end of that is really what is 5G.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're trying to meet the current 5G requirements or the timeline for release 15, certain things do fall by the wayside. So it's not like you're splitting functionality 50-50. Yeah. You're getting a lot done, but there's still a lot more work to be done in release 16 to get to what I would consider to be the real 5G standard.
Gotcha. So, but there is no talk at all about 4.5G, 4.75G, or 4.9G, correct? No one's actually bringing up those terms. They are going 4G to 5G and not going to all the marketing stuff in between, correct?
Yeah. Well, I still refuse to say or to write the term 4G.
Thank you.
Because it's meaningless now. You had mobile WiMAX, you had HS, PA plus, or even HSDPA, qualified as being a quote unquote 4G technology, even if in the initial LTE standard as well, that was not considered by 3GPP to be 4G.
Exactly. Yeah.
LTE-Advanced was going to be their so-called 4G technology. But so now even within LTE, with all the various features you have with carrier aggregation and the uplink, downlink, higher modulation schemes, calling everything 4G is very ambiguous. Yeah. So I like talking about, so what underlying features are you really talking about? One other quick comment here. We talked about, I think it was probably 4 or 5 months ago, talking about how instead of calling it 5G, it's new radio.
Yeah.
And that came out of the March meeting. Well, interestingly enough, that's going to change again. So I'm not quite sure what it's going to be. I suggested calling it PDQ. For pretty darn quick. I don't know that there's a lot of interest there. My vote doesn't matter, but I will tell you that a lot of the terms, and the overall broad term for so-called 5G, it's not going to be 5G, it's not going to be NR, but we'll probably know in the coming weeks or months what to call it.
A whole new acronym to learn for everybody.
Acronym. And then, of course, all new acronyms. For what do you call a base station? What do you call certain core network elements? You can't call it an eNode B.
Yeah.
You can't call it a 5G base station. So what are you going to call it? And that stuff's being kind of worked out, and there's a lot of potato arguments back and forth. But I think there is, from what I've seen, generally agreement on what you call some of these various nodes in the network. Interesting.
I mean, a final question maybe on the topic too, and again, there's a lot more in the report that you can obviously go to the Signals Research Group website and get the report. It's got a lot of good information, but also a lot of good wordplay from Michael as well in there, which is always fun. And also, I like your reference at the beginning of the report to your previous trip to New Orleans and having I think it was IP Wireless and Flareon at the same event, which I think everybody knows back in the day was a pretty mean feat to have those two together anywhere. So good insight there on that as well. But I guess maybe one thing, kind of final question would be, has there been any sort of impact that the upcoming the Olympics situation, obviously with Korea having the Olympics 2018, 2018 Korea, I believe 2020 Japan. Has that at all kind of been brought up at all as a timing issue for some of the operators? I know, in the previous Olympics, countries are always trying to show off technology for those as well. Was that at all brought up, or has that kind of been still kind of downplayed to at least to this extent?
No, it definitely comes up. And in fact, I remember going back to the September workshop, one of the North American operators was basically talking about how we have these artificial timelines that are driven by sporting events and nothing else. but just it's interesting, KT is part of, my understanding is they're kind of deploying the Verizon specification. SK Telecom is doing something as well. I don't think people should have high expectations for what, this is going to be. I mean, I think it'll be very similar to what Verizon had. Verizon made a big push talking about LTE broadcast at the Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
So this goes back 2 years ago at Mobile World Congress. They said by the next Super Bowl, we're going to have LTE broadcast available in the stadium. Well, you fast forward, a year, and I was actually there. I didn't go to the Super Bowl, but I was there in New York City. It was a tent, in downtown Manhattan where you could go in and see a pre-commercial implementation of LTE broadcast. So it was nowhere near what they were initially promising. So if I get the chance to go to the Olympics, I expect to see, the Olympic Stadium area maybe covered with a 5G-like solution, but to suggest that everybody was going to be walking around with handsets and doing, millimeter wave, broadcast of video and whatnot, I just don't see it. It's going to be a nice demonstration. If I go and I get a handset or get a device, it'll be nice, but it's not going to be a commercial solution available to the masses by any means.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, like I said, there's always a lot more information from the report that you guys just put out. Definitely recommend anybody who's interested in this at all to go to the website and download it. A lot of other good reports in there too. There's one that came out recently on QAM. A lot of work you guys are doing in that too. Again, a lot of good insight that it's always hard to get to all of it, but definitely you can always check it out there and always contact Michael as well for some follow-up there. But Mike, always appreciate you stopping by and talking with us. Again, it's kind of nice to get a little bit of inside perspective of what's happening in the 3GPP process towards 5G. So we definitely appreciate the time and insight on that today. Thanks so much. And hopefully we'll touch base again soon.
Sure. Sounds good.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks.
Well, thanks for watching this week's show. And make sure to check out our next Tier app when we are scheduled to speak with Burj Abbasian from Wireless 2020 about where the FCC stands ahead of its planned Stage 3 of the 600 megahertz incentive auction proceedings. Thanks for watching.